So how, now, how long have you been teaching for now? How long has it been since your awakening?
30 years.
So, so in terms
It's
of,
kind of embarrassing to hear it called an awakening, but thanks for the vote of confidence anyway.
so, I mean, it seems like there's been a lot's happened in the last 30 years
Tremendous
in the
amount.
evolution and development of
Sure.
the East meets West movement.
Tremendous,
And,
of course.
and obviously it's still happening now. So I would be interested to hear how you see that time from the vantage point you have now, and how you see where we are now in relationship to what happened then, and how you see the future.
Well, I think I was very naive in those days, so I view the whole process of spiritual development as a kind of a almost parallel process to being born and growing up.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the last 30 years as having had a birth and a childhood and a teenage period,
Right.
and adolescence.
Okay. In terms of is it in terms of yourself or in terms of the movement itself?
In terms of myself.
Okay.
I think in terms of
So now, in terms of yourself, you feel you're coming into some degree of maturity.
Well, in the sense that I have a whole different. I mean, in the early days, it was here's the truth, hear the truth, live the truth, wake up, end of story.
Mm-hmm. Well, ideally, that's how it works.
After 20 years, when I looked around for all these awakened disciples I was supposed to have, and there weren't any, I started to look at things a little differently, and so both with a whole different degree of patience and forbearance, and also a whole different degree of impatience. So in the beginning, I was very aggressive, but also very tolerant, and now I'm non-aggressive and intolerant. So things have really shifted for me personally in my teaching work. So, I'm willing to allow people to make a tremendous amount of mistakes, understanding that no matter how many times I correct people's mistakes, people are only going to learn when they learn. And, I'll be as much help as people want.
So what do you think? Because to me, that's the magic bullet. Is when any given individual is going to get to that point in their own developmental line, when for whatever reason they are going to decide that I can't go on the way I have been anymore, and I must make a decision to change, absolutely and irrevocably. And I've also noticed that there's nothing that anybody else, no matter who they are, can do about that.
Yeah. That's the frustrating part.
That's the $64,000 question, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. But also in terms of the world, I think that people have really been distracted from the path by. I think the world is much more of a wonderland now than it was then.
Wonderland in which sense?
Technology, computers, computer games, the internet, the opportunity for free and open sexual perversion. I mean, we were just in Las Vegas last week, and now the official name of Las Vegas is Sin City. I mean, 30 years ago, could never, nobody would even consider that, and now it's celebrated. I mean, we were there, and the place was packed. I mean, every casino, every restaurant, packed, because it's Sin City. So I think, in the 70s, there was a real kind of innocent expectation. The hippies were really making, in the news, and people were standing up for their political views, even if it meant being hit on the head by a policeman or sent to jail. And those days are, there's still a lot of people who are very committed to their ideals and willing to stand for them, but that kind of innocence, it's so rare these days. And so, but also, I think that the whole phenomena of people being willing to seek serious help from a teacher is coming back. So I think, it was like in the 70s, and it really peaked, and then took a nosedive with the gurus within kind of a business. But I think it's going to come back. I can feel we're sort of to me, it feels like we're on the edge of a return to, in maybe smaller numbers of people, but a serious commitment to.
But what you're talking about would have to be hierarchy, really, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I think about it, it seems that at that time there was, for those people who discovered consciousness and discovered the potential for enlightenment, the whole notion of the evolution of consciousness, there was a tremendous amount of idealism. Mm-hmm. And of course, in retrospect, maybe some of it was an expression of naivete, of mm-hmm. a lack of experience and a lack of maturity, mm-hmm. a lack of understanding. So what was so enthralling and wonderful about it was the passionate idealism, mm-hmm. and the seeing the postmodern, young adult, mm-hmm. Finding belief and conviction in well, not only in a higher principle, but I mean in a spiritual principle, mm-hmm. but also but inherent in that would be a philosophical, an awakened philosophical context, it's just not there in secular culture.
Sure.
And to me it seems that the most important thing for the postmodern, young adults and adults is the lack of conviction in the inherent goodness, mm-hmm. of life, of the life process.
Sure, I think people are very cynical these days.
Right, but of course that would, but when there is when there's a fundamental cynicism and a sense of doubt, at a deep existential level, that has a very big effect on the way one orients oneself in relationship to life itself.
Well, of course.
Yeah. So there's that switch from being full of cynicism and doubt at a deep existential level to one of faith and conviction is really the big switch, because I don't actually think that without a highly developed faith and conviction, without strong faith and conviction, mm-hmm. it's not possible to really develop. I mean, I almost think that the faith and conviction is what makes it possible for really develop. So anyway, I think that in the 70s, at that time, when a lot of people were discovering mm-hmm. enlightenment and the possibility of enlightenment, there was a lot of excitement and conviction about the possibility of people really evolving and really, really changing. And as I was saying, as you agreed, a lot of the idealism was coming from a naivete because of a lack of experience. Mm-hmm. And then there was, of course, I think part of the problem had to do with the fact that many of the teachers that were being looked to as examples were coming to us from pre-modern cultural contexts, mm-hmm. right? And we were in a postmodern cultural context, and there was a real clash.
Whatever that means.
It means in many ways that we were more developed in many ways and knew a lot, and in terms of our perspectives, right. tended to be a lot more inclusive, yeah. and less rigid, and maybe more enlightened in many ways. Mm-hmm. And yet, what we lacked was the knowledge and experience of this miraculous depth, yes. at the level of consciousness. And then, of course, though, because many of these teachers possess the experience of this depth, this higher consciousness, of course we assume, because they were enlightened, that they're supposed to know everything, be omniscient, be perfect. And of course, where we were at culturally, in terms of our development, was this time of transition. The old way of living, it was one that we had all stepped out of, or we're in the process of stepping out of, right? And mm-hmm. so basically we were in new territory. How I don't want to live the way my parents did. But there weren't any maps.
Right.
There weren't any maps. And so then many people began to look to a lot of the Eastern teachers for the maps of how to live a human life, because they were supposed to be enlightened, supposed to know everything. And most of the Eastern teachers had were pre-modern notions of really about how to live. And many of them whether they were individuals who had renounced the world and become, monks or not, their notions of how to live and make sense out of the human experience was still very traditional. Okay, but for many of us, we have, and I think we're still at that point. We've reached a point where the next leap is going to be it's a post-traditional, it's some kind of post-traditional alternative in terms of how to live and how to make sense out of the human experience. And the Easterners, of course, couldn't help us with that because often when it came to thinking about how do I make sense out of human experience and how do I actually live it, a lot of the ideas about a lot of their own ideas and beliefs were very pre-modern and absolutely inappropriate for a postmodern culture, for those individuals in a postmodern culture who were truly looking to embrace the future. And I think there was a real clash there because as we were speaking about before, in order to step forward, we can't step back. And of course, we also found out that what it means to be enlightened, what it means to have access to higher consciousness, what it actually means in relationship to being a human being, and the whole misunderstood notion of what perfection is all about, became a big issue because we've discovered that a lot of the masters were, had enormous failings on a human level, even in terms of basic moral issues. And so I think for several of these reasons, there were a lot of the fervent passion and conviction that many people had. Oh my God, this enormous change is possible. I think began to disintegrate, and it began to disintegrate in a lot of important people. And then en masse, I think the conviction and the belief of this higher potential began to disintegrate in the 80s and into the 90s. And it didn't mean people stopped seeking, but the passionate idealism, the fervent idealism that was so much alive when you started was very much dampened by that same cynicism, which with the cynicism means it's not possible, and I don't believe it. And and at the same time, development has continued. In this whole East meets West stew it's been cooking. The development has continued and is continuing up until this very moment right now, and even in terms of fundamental convictions about what it even means to evolve. What consciousness is all about, and so even, for example, what you were just saying, that there was a certain point when many gurus or masters or people who are believed to be masters were found to have major flaws when it got to morality and ethics. People began to doubt the whole thing, and then people became very unwilling to put that much faith or that much trust in any human being, and then they basically just resumed their
narcissistic.
Well, the narcissism. I mean, that's basically that's what we're rooted in. But the egalitarian position of basically we're equal, nobody tells me what to do, we're all on the same level, nobody's higher than me. But as you've obviously found out and discovered, and as I have too, that as long as we're unwilling to admit hierarchy, in relationship to consciousness, which means some people, we're not all at the same place. Some people have actually evolved to a higher level of development than others. If we're not willing to acknowledge that and grapple with that in a very real way ourselves, we're not even going to begin to be able to see what's possible. Because if it's an egalitarian worldview is what we're fundamentally attached to, we're going to insist on everything being flat and everything being on the same level, no matter what's happening. Everything's going to be reduced. We're going to reduce everything to the same level. And when we're willing to resist the temptation to do that, then we're willing to admit hierarchy and beginning to make distinctions, see differences, and then I think the possibility for real development opens up then. And I think what you might have been indicating before was that maybe that's what's beginning to happen now.
Well, I think I'm having had a master who died 5 years ago, and having been deeply and profoundly committed to him as my master. And in the beginning, when I first met him, I looked at him in an egalitarian way. Well, he's Indian, he's a good yogi, but, in terms of the actual understanding of consciousness, well, we're all the same. But that radically shifted in my relationship to him over the years.
Specifically in relationship to?
He was just in a different place than I was. It was
right, in relation to the notion of hierarchy.
Absolutely.
That he was in a higher place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it.
Which meant for you that?
Well, which meant for me that a lot of what I thought was coming from me was really coming from him through me. So my relationship to him became more one of becoming more and more transparent to his wisdom, so that my lack of wisdom didn't get in the way. And without that relationship in a hierarchical system, I firmly believe in the need for a hierarchical system. And without that, I probably would have gone off the deep end like many other teachers.
But what you're saying, I think, is very important, especially in terms of what you brought up before, in terms of you think that some more serious people may be beginning to become interested in the.
I think very much so.
Teacher-student relationship now.
But also, I'm a firm believer in tradition, in the essence of tradition, because I think that the laws of consciousness are the same now as they ever were, but the world we live in is not the same as it ever was. So I'm a firm believer in the need for a response to universal laws, but not necessarily trying to recreate the old times and the old forms and the old.
No, we have to create new ones. I mean, at least I believe that we need to create new ones, because the old ones, I don't think, are able to really meet the needs many of us actually have as evolving human beings at the beginning of the 21st century, because the world has changed and is changing so fast that, in other words, I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we need structure.
Absolutely.
Right. So we
I'm
need
a firm believer in structure.
Okay, but saying we need structure, that's taking a big step away from the postmodern boomer's position that that what's good for me is what's right.
Sure, of course.
Right, and the indicator of what's right, good, and true, or appropriate has to do with how the self feels about it.
Well,
okay,
who knows what the self is?
Well, whatever it is, I mean, but for the postmodern, highly developed narcissistic separate self sense, this strongly individuated separate self sense, that really is the fulcrum, or the prime, central location to which everything everything goes, and from which we determine just about everything. But in a structure where there's in a conceptual matrix or framework where there's hierarchy, we realize, well, there's something higher, deeper, more true, more meaningful, more significant than me, which is what changes everything.
Sure.
And what you're saying is, at every level of development, I suppose, as long as we're going to be in human form, this probably is always going to be the case. There's always going to be that. And so, for example, when you met your teacher, he at least potentially enabled you to continue your development.
Absolutely.
Because he helped you to orient yourself in relationship to something higher in a way that was tangible, that was obviously very helpful for you.
Well,
right?
that was one of the things that was so great about him, was he set a context for my own process without trying to define that context with a particular form. That was his form. He was Indian, he was a renunciate, and he lived in a very very stark environment, and wore the same clothes for a year. And he, in no way demanded that of anyone that found him and wanted to use him as a reference point for, for a higher point in the hierarchy. So he understood I was American, he understood I was educated in a different way, and that I led a different life. And he was willing to influence my life as it was in the West to reach higher, without demanding that I follow a specific set of guidelines that he set up that followed his particular process. And that was one of the things I appreciated tremendously about him, is he never told me what to do or defined anything, and yet his blessing force, his blessing influence completely permeated my life, but did in no way try to turn me into an Indian, in fact, one of my students suggested he give me an Indian name, and he absolutely ridiculed it. He said, Lozowick is your name, that's your name, so what's the problem? And he was very clear he didn't want us wearing Indian clothes and taking on Indian affectations. And so he allowed us to progress or transform in our environment, in our time and place, as was relevant for our circumstances. And there was a very clear hierarchy. So if anyone, which certainly I experienced at times, stepped out of the hierarchical system and became a little too familiar or a little too pretentious, he would absolutely stop it instantly. And I very much appreciated that. So.
One thing I would like to talk about with you, which is something I'm very interested in, which is something that it's a phrase that Ken Wilber, I think, came up with, which is called the Guru Principle. And I have a small little booklet about it that I wrote about that. So I define this Guru Principle as, in a certain way, something I'd like to speak to you about, because I know it's obviously something that you obviously would know about. Now, there's a difference.
One would hope so at this point.
Well, yeah. So there's a difference between being a teacher and a guru. So a teacher is someone who has learned a lot about a particular subject, and who can teach you about it. But they have not become the very thing that they're teaching. Okay? And I would say for someone who within whom this Guru Principle had authentically or genuinely been awakened, which it would mean to some degree, and to what degree is would be another discussion, but to some degree that individual had literally become one with the very thing that they were teaching. Now, if what we're speaking about is higher consciousness itself, or the actual evolution of consciousness, it would mean that individual, in a very profound way, had become one with the force or the impulse, the spiritual impulse, or the impulse towards evolution at the highest level, the level of consciousness itself. They literally become non-separate from that evolutionary developmental impulse, the impulse towards consciousness, the spiritual impulse. Now, it's a delicate subject because a lot of people don't understand this, but my understanding of what we're calling the Guru Principle is, I understand it to be a teaching function. So a teaching function means that if this principle has been awakened in an individual, and there are even people who are awakened and have some degree of enlightenment in whom this function has not necessarily been awakened.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in an individual in whom or with whom it has been awakened, they discover that there is a part of them that is beyond their conscious control, or even knowing. It's impossible to have a dualistic relationship or even knowledge of this part of oneself that that cares passionately, fervently and passionately about the evolution of consciousness, because that is the nature of that function. That's what that function is. It is the evolutionary principle of functioning in human consciousness, because of course it can't function outside human consciousness. There's no way it could express itself. But when it's become awakened, this function this function is what is doing the teaching, right? It's not the historical individual as much as it is this teaching function that is using the vehicle of the awakened individual for its own purposes. And the guru principle is awe-inspiring because it, in a sense, that's God speaking. That's God speaking to all of us, right? Through whoever it is, and and how, and of course the degree of profundity and the degree of clarity, of course, is going to also be dependent. It's going to depend upon the evolution and development of the vehicle itself. But that kind of fervent, awakened passion for the evolution of consciousness for its own sake is something to behold. It's obviously something that you saw in your own teacher. That's what drew you to him. I'm sure that's what draws people to you. Well, yeah.
That's very generous of you. I would say, the way I would language it is that it's it's the degree to which my teacher has taken me over that attracts people to me. Yeah,
it's the same thing.
But I would reference it. I would always reference it through my teacher, not through myself.
Okay.
Ultimately, it's the same thing.
It's the same thing. Okay, but the interesting thing about this guru principle or this teaching function is that in Western culture, you see, there is absolutely no context for understanding the awakening of a teaching function or a guru principle, or in other words, so it's because the guru principle is a function of consciousness that has its own will, and so in a Western cultural context, there's almost no reference point for this, or one that we can understand. How can we understand that kind of passion, that kind of care, that kind of impersonal passion?
Well, I think that's one of the things that enamors people so much of the East.
Yes,
is that they feel that and they sense it, and then a lot of the process is an educational one, because we sense it and we feel it and we're drawn towards it, but we don't have context. And not having context, we project upon it, we misunderstand it, we interpret it, we try and translate it into our own flat worldview, and which doesn't work, it can't possibly work.
So now, in terms of speaking about the evolution of consciousness, I think that it's the presence of this kind of teaching function in the world that creates what I call, anyway, evolutionary tension. The awakening of the teaching function in the guru or the teacher is not separate from that which causes the seeker to seek. It's the same principle.
Sure.
That's seeking itself. So what the student recognizes in the teacher is not any different than what the teacher recognizes in the student. It's self-attracted to itself. And in that dynamic, there's an evolutionary tension, there's an evolutionary dynamic, there's an evolutionary friction that where there is an incessant demand for more, deeper, higher, more, deeper, higher, more, deeper, higher, perpetually and forever.
Well, I would say in our contemporary world, it's a kind of a parallel principle to when Padmasambhava went to Tibet, and the way it's described. In those days, Padmasambhava went to Tibet. Tibet was full of demons and rakshasas who had no sense of the truth or of any spirituality, and he converted them all to Buddhism, and then they began to help perpetuate the Dharma and protect the Dharma. And so in our day and age, it's like what we're having to do is convert the demons of what you called postmodern narcissism. It's like we're having to actually do the same thing that Padmasambhava did, except it's not wild nature spirits and multi-armed demon and red and blue demons. It's the world of business. It's the seductions of money and power and sex and fame, and those are the demons that we're having to convert to a context of a hierarchical view of evolution and process. So I see it as relatively different and yet the same, which is why I call myself a lover of tradition, because the principle's the same. The form and content is radically different, but the principle's the same, the way I see it.
Yeah, and do you agree that and I agree with you 100%, that now therefore we need to reconfigure a new structure, which is what tradition represents, which is a structure. In other words, this is what life's all about. This is a context in which to interpret your experience, in which to relate to what it means to be alive, right? Which is, of course, what we all desperately need.
Sure.
Which is what, of course, your generation, my generation, didn't want it. We wanted to be free. We wanted to be free from structure. But of course, we've all found out the hard way that without structure, we simply can't move forward. And of course, there's always going to be a rare individual that somehow manages to. But basically, without structure, we will flounder.
Yeah.
And what's most likely to happen is that we're not going to develop at all.
Well, I agree with you.
Yeah. So in terms of this whole notion of tradition,
I wish I didn't. I'd like to have a really good argument with you, but I have to agree with you.
But in terms
I'd lose, of course, but it would be fun anyway.
But no, but in terms of the whole notion of tradition, though, does it make sense to you that we agree that the tradition is essential, but in this context we're going to have to reconfigure and reinterpret and reinvent what tradition means?
Well, I think relative to any description of it, absolutely.
Yeah, because
the essence of it, no, but
the essence of it, which is structure in which to interpret, the human experience.
But to language it in our time and place, absolutely.
Well,
of course.
Well, more than language, literally to redevelop, because we're going to have to think from the ground up. If we really think about it, the world's totally different, and as we were speaking over lunch, it's changing faster and faster and faster. So we need to then reconfigure or think about or develop together a structure that would be most appropriate for the time we're living in, and that would involve a lot of discussion, a lot of inquiry, because it was what's the most appropriate, the most sane, the most meaningful way to live a human life at the beginning of the 21st century in a context that is based on the submission to the sacred dimension of life.
Yeah.
In a way that in a way that completely embraces the actuality of the time we're living in. Now, this is what I'm very, very interested in. But I think this in order for this to happen, I think many of us need to really discuss a lot of the fundamental issues, because they're all open questions. I don't think anybody has the answers to these questions. A lot of the fundamental questions of what's the most appropriate way to live a human life. Nobody has the answers, and I think And I think in order to be able to come to some of the answers, a lot of people who are really pushing the edge or interested need to just speak about it together more and more. And I think slowly we need to really come to some kind of agreement, some kind of understanding of what that kind of structure would look like, in this context. Because I have no idea what it would be, but I know that it's absolutely necessary, and I also know, consciously or unconsciously, everybody is dying for it.
Sure. Well, I think Arnaud Desjardins' master Swami Prajnanpad said that he used two phrases, which were intrinsic dignity and intrinsic nobility. And he said that every human being at the level of intrinsic dignity and intrinsic nobility automatically knows how to live. And if we're intelligent, we're educated, we know how to adjust to the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So obviously different than the circumstances 50 years ago. So my whole emphasis is on a kind of instinctual search for that intrinsic dignity and that intrinsic nobility. And from that, I mean, by definition, to be noble and to be dignified is to have integrity, to practice with impeccability, to live rightly and justly, and so like that. And who, I mean, who knows how to, I think as you said before, people find that, if people don't make an absolutely fundamental decision, an irrevocable, radical decision, then, they play around the edges, they discuss it, and how to, is it, not even how to, is there any way to optimize the possibility that people can make that radical decision? That's sort of, the way I would language the whole situation.
Yeah, and I think it even makes sense that if some kind of structure can be collectively created together, I think it will serve the evolutionary process in ways that we can't even yet see, because I think the structure itself will be a catalyst for a kind of development it'll probably becomes a self-generating container that might make a movement for a lot of people possible in ways that wouldn't otherwise happen.
Sure.
And
well, that was Tibetan Buddhism for 1,000 years, and I think the Tibetan Buddhists are hoping that it goes on for another 1,000 years, but it may well not.
Well, no, because that's kind of a medieval worldview there. It's not gonna work. It's not gonna work. But I think a lot of what we're speaking about is something that Westerners, I think it's really in our hands to do, because what's happening in the East, of course, the East are beginning to become interested in many things that we were interested in, for the 20th, in the whole 20th century, and many of us are in a position where we can really look beyond that.
Yeah, I also feel that the primary evolution of spirituality will be in the West.
Yeah. So I guess we got a lot of work to do.
Boy.
Thanks, Lee.
Pleasure.